So we were learning yesterday that there's no real thing as ownership of a Canaanite slave to a Gentile. A Gentile is not capable of owning a slave, a non-Jewish slave. One Gentile cannot own another Gentile. A Jew can own a Gentile, but a Gentile cannot own a Gentile slave. And as a result, we learned about a case yesterday where a Jew pays money for the purchase of a Gentile slave from a Gentile who owns the slave. The Gentile slave goes to mikveh on the way to the house of the Jew to become, for the sake of gerus, for the sake of conversion to Judaism. The Gemara therefore states that as a result of his immersion in the mikveh, he's emancipated himself, because he's not owned by anyone at that moment until he actually is taken under physical acquisition by the Jew. He's not owned by the former master, the goy, and he's not yet owned by the Jew, and therefore by him going to mikveh, he's able to free himself from slavery.
But a Jew can own a Jew.
A Jew can own a Hebrew slave, right? A Hebrew slave, right? But for a limited amount of time,
okay.
Right? So now the Gemara says, Masiv Rav Chisda, which is the fifth line of the Gemara. So we're going to challenge that premise. Maisa bibluria hagiyores shekatmu avodeha v'tavlu lefaneha uba maisa lifnei chachamim v'amru kanu atzman b'nei chorim. The story is brought in a brisa. There was a famous Giores whose name was Bluria. She converted to Judaism, but before she converted, her servants, she was a very wealthy matron, her servants converted before her. And as a result, the Chachamim said that they emancipated themselves thereby. Now, what do you see from that story? Lefaneha in le'achareha lo. That only because they went to mikveh before she converted to Judaism were they considered to be converts and emancipated thereby. But let's say she would have converted first. Even though she didn't take physical acquisition of them, the very fact that they were still in some way connected to her, they would not be able to go to mikveh. So it seems that you see from here that just by virtue of the fact that the Jew pays money, he does some act to connect himself to the slave, then he does acquire them, and their act of going to mikveh would not work. That's what it seems from the story. So Amar Rava says no. The difference between the two is lefaneha bein bistam bein mimeforash, leachareha b'meforash in bistam lo. So Rava tells you that no, really the halacha does not change based on that story. That story was talking about where they went to the mikveh without explicitly saying that we are going to the mikveh for the sake of conversion, for the sake of emancipating ourselves. In that situation, since they didn't go for the verbalize explicitly that we're going to mikveh to emancipate ourselves, therefore, only if they went to mikveh before she became Jewish would such a tvila, would such an immersion work. But indeed, even if you're purchased by a Yisrael, before you actually start working for him, you go ahead to the mikveh. As long as you state explicitly, my immersion is for the purpose of conversion so that I can go free as a free man, so then that will work even if you're already under the tutelage in some way of the Jew.
So does this mean that you need kavanah?
It's not a question of kavanah, it's a question of explicit statement. It sounds like that you need kavanah in both cases. It's a question of lefaresh, to actually verbalize the idea.
But isn't that a problem also because a conversion, which isn't l'shem shemayim, is got some other...
That's a good point. That's a good point. It seems like these people are converting so that they can be emancipated. Is it still a good gerus? It sounds like from all of these sugyas that even though lechatchila we would not permit such a conversion, but b'di'evet it's still kosher. And that seems to be how we paskin as well. Amar Avivya lo shanu ela belokeach min ha'obe kochavim, abel obe kochavim gufei kani. Rav Ivya gives a different answer. He says it's not contingent upon what was stated at the time of immersion, but rather the difference between the two stories, between our first story where a Jew bought a slave from a goy, and the case of Bluria's servants is very simple. In the first case, you're purchasing the slaves from a goy. And since you're taking delivery from a goy who can never have actual possession of them, so you can't get more from the goy than what he than what he has. And since he has no legal acquisition of the slave's body, you cannot acquire the slave's body from him. And as a result, the slave can go to mikveh and emancipate himself. But in the second case of Beluria, she already, through her, if she would have converted to Judaism, she's not acquiring the slaves from anyone. They're already considered to be part of her domain. And as such, it is possible for a Jew to automatically acquire slaves that are already under his or her tutelage. And that's why they would have automatically become her slaves if she had converted first before they had gone to mikveh. And the Gemara explains, Dichsiv, as the pasuk says, V'gam mibnei hatoshavim hagorimi machem mehem tiknu. The pasuk, in talking about slavery in the Middle East, says that from among the residents that dwell with you, you are allowed to purchase. And the Raizel learns, Atem konim mehem, velo heim konim mikem, that you can purchase slaves from them, but they cannot purchase slaves from you. Velo heim konim ze mizeh, nor can they purchase slaves from each other. Now we need to clarify what this statement means. Velo heim konim mikem lamai. When it says that they cannot buy slaves from you, meaning that a Gentile cannot acquire a Jewish slave, what are we talking about? If you're just telling me for the work product, meaning that there's two different kinds of slavery that the Gemara is distinguishing. One is where the master actually owns the body of the slave, and the other one is where the master owns the work product of the slave, but the slave is not considered to be the property, the chattel of the master, but he's an indentured servant. He's a person that has to, for a certain amount of money, basically commits all of the work that he's going to do for the next 20, 30, or 50 years to the master. So that certainly can happen even when a Gentile purchases that from a Jew. Because v'haksiv ola eker mishpachas ger, because the Torah explicitly says that it is possible for a Jew to sell himself to the family of a convert. V'omar mar mishpachas ger ze'obiko chavim. This refers to a heathen, refers to an idolater. So elalav legufe. So rather that whole statement about selling slaves, that a Jew can acquire a goy cannot acquire a Jew, and a goy cannot acquire another goy, is referring to the actual body of the slave. So you see that it is possible for a Jew to acquire the body of a slave, and therefore Beluria was able to acquire the actual bodies of the slaves. Had they gone to mikveh only after she had converted, it would have been too late, because by default, by them living under her domain, they would have naturally become her property. And that's the difference, because when you purchase from a goy, the goy can only relinquish the rights that he has, which is which is not his body. But when you acquire them on your own, so then you can acquire their body. So Parach Rav Acha, Ema bekaspa uvitvila. So Rav Acha challenges that, and he says, how do you know that it is possible to acquire a slave by just paying money, or by just having them live in your domain? Maybe, we know that there's a requirement that when a Gentile becomes the slave of a Jew, the Gentile, in order to be considered to be an Evet Kanani, to be chayiv in mitzvahs, and to be truly the acquisition of the Jew, there has to be money paid, plus he's got to go to mikveh. Now here, the immersion in the mikveh is not for conversion, but it is rather to make him into an Evet Kanani, which places certain responsibilities upon him as a slave. So maybe, even in the case of Beluria, just by virtue of the fact that she would have converted before her Gentile slaves, how does that automatically make them her property? Maybe they would first have to be compensated, and they would have to go to mikveh. So even in the case of Beluria, it's not clear that had she converted first, that they would have automatically become her slaves. Yeah. So the Gemara says, Kasha, the Gemara says, you're right. I don't have an answer to that question.
You also need a bris, no?
Right. You need to have, it seems like you need to have a bris, although we haven't seen that explicitly yet in the Gemara, but it seems that an Eved Kanani needs to have a bris from other Gemaras. So Amar Shmuel. So Shmuel now adds, V'tzarech l'takvo b'mayim, that as a result of that statement, we know that in order to declare someone an Eved Kanani as the acquisition of a Jew, you have to actually do something to demonstrate that when he goes to mikveh, he's going to mikveh as an Eved Kanani, not for the sake of conversion to emancipate himself. And how do you do that? You have to actually force him physically into the water to demonstrate that you're in charge of his immersion. Kihai de minyamin avde de Ravashi ba'alat bule masreini halayu l'ravina u'l'ravacha b'rei de Rava. That there was once a case of Minyamin, who was the servant of Ravashi, and he wanted to toivel him to make him his official Eved Kanani, but he gave over sort of like the jurisdiction over to Ravina and to Ravacha, and Amar Lahu, and he said to them, I want you to preside over this case because chazu deminaychu kabo ilay, that I want you to know that from him I am seeking to create a Neved Kanani, so that if he tries to say that I'm toiveling for the sake of emancipating myself, I want you to preside over this and prevent that from happening. So what did they do? So Ramule Arvisa Bitsavare, Arfule Vitsimtsumule. So what they did is they took a type of collar apparatus, tied it around his neck, and it was one of these collars that by pulling on it you tighten it, and by letting it slack it becomes loose around the neck. And so first they made it loose while he was in the water, and then they tightened it. Now why did they do that? Arfule ki hechidelo lihavi chatzitza, tzimtzumule ki hechidelo likdim v'leim alahu l'shem ben chorin ani toivel. So they loosened it so that when he was in the immersed in the water, there would be no chatzitza, so that the water would completely envelop his body. And then they tightened it to prevent him from being able to say that I'm doing this of my own volition for the sake of emancipating myself and being Megayer. So Bahadi Dedali Reishim Imaya Anchule Zulta Detina Areshe the Amrule Zil Amati Lebe Marach. And as soon as he got his head, in other words, I guess they must have sort of forcibly dunked him in the water with this collar. And then as soon as they let him lift up his head, they took a pile of bricks and stuck it on his head. And they said, take this now to your master's house. In other words, you have to actually physically demonstrate that you're still an indentured servant. And in this way, they were able to prevent him from trying to use the tvila as a pretense for emancipation. Amarle Rav Papa Rava. Thank God we don't have slavery anymore. Amarle Rav Papa Rava. Chazi Mar Hani Deve Papa Bar Abba Diyavi Zuzi Leinshi Lekargaihu Umishabdi Buhu Kinafki Tzrichi Gita de Cherusa Olo. So there was a person called Papa Bar Abba. He was a very wealthy man, and there were Gentiles in his neighborhood for whom he paid the obligatory tax to the crown. And as a result, he was able to demand work from them in exchange for his payment for their head tax. So the question now is his payment of their head tax an acquisition of them as slaves, to the point where in order for them to be considered free men, he would have to write them a writ of emancipation, a get shechur, or no? So Amarle, Iku Shechivi lo Amri Luchu Hamilsa. So Rava says, I'm glad that you asked me now, because if you would have asked me after I had died, I wouldn't be able to tell you the following halacha. Hachi Amar of Sheshes, Muhar Kaihu Dahani Betafsa de Balka Monach, Umalka Omar Mandelo Yoiv Karga Mishtabid Laman de Yoiv Karga. That really, in actuality, the seal of each individual is in the possession of the king's treasury. So that anyone who owes the tax to the king is in a registry. And if anyone does not pay their taxes, they become a slave to the king. And if someone were to pay the head tax for them, then that person becomes the indentured servant of that individual. So because the law of the land is such, therefore these people are actually slaves to Papa Bar Abba, and therefore they need to have a writ of emancipation. Rabbi Chia Bar Abba Ikla Legavla. Now we're going back to our discussion of converts, and not only of converts, but Gentiles who have intimacy with Jewish girls, and what is the product of their union. So Reb Chia bar Abba once comes to a town called Gavla, and he saw three things that were very irregular. The first thing that he saw is that there were Gentiles who converted to Judaism through circumcision but never went to mikveh, and they were impregnating Jewish girls. The second irregularity is that he saw Jewish kosher wine being poured and served by Gentile waiters, and the Jews would drink it. And the third irregularity that he saw is that he noticed that there was a certain vegetable called a turmus, it's like a turnip. You can't eat it raw. You can only eat it when it's boiled thoroughly. And he noted that Gentiles were cooking this and Jews were eating it. So v'lo amar lahu v'lo midi. So for these three things, which were irregularities, because of course a guy converts without going to mikveh, a Gentile pours, kosher wine is going to create a problem, and also what's the third issue? Bishalakum, right? It's a third issue. So, but he didn't say anything in objection. Also lakami de Rabbi Yochanan, but when he told Rabbi Yochanan about what he had saw, Amar leit say v'hachriz al b'neim shehem mamzerim v'al yena mishum yain nesech v'al turmusan mishum bishuli ovdei kochavim lefi she'enon b'nei Torah. So he says all three are problematic, says Rabbi Yochanan. Declare their children to be mamzerim, their wine is considered to be yain nesech, and their turmus vegetables are usher for them to eat because they're not scholarly people. Now what that means we'll see in just a second. Al b'neim shehem mamzerim, the first declaration that their children are mamzerim is Rabbi Yochanan l'taimei da Amar Reb Chia bar Abba Amar Rabbi Yochanan la'olam ein ger ad sheyimol v'yitbol v'keven d'lo tovil lo b'kol chavimhu. That number one, it's not a good conversion because he only had circumcision and he didn't have immersion, and if so he's still a goy. We know Rabbi Yochanan is l'shitaso, that he says that if a Gentile impregnates a Jewish woman, the child's going to be a mamzer. And we said we don't paskin that way, but at least Rabbi Yochanan was consistent. Why is the wine yayin nesach, even though the Gentile never even touched the wine, even though he didn't pour it for idolatrous purposes? This is one of the chumras, which we call stam yena, which means, and the way that the Gemara phrases it as a chumrah is, go, we say to the Nazir, circumvent, do not come close to the vineyard. Meaning that if you're a Nazir, it's the rabbi's responsibility to ensure that you don't even come close to a vineyard to avoid you consuming grape products. And in the same way, the rabbis made a safeguard around yayin nesech, that they said that all wine that's even poured by a Gentile is rendered non-kosher. And finally, ve'al turmusan mishum bishuli ovdei kochavim lefi she'enon b'nei Torah. The third thing was, we want you to ban the turmus vegetable because these people are not learned. So ha b'nei Torah shari. So you mean to tell me if they were learned people, the turmus vegetable would be permitted? But why should that be? V'ha'amar of Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak mishmei derav kol hanechol kamo shehu chai ein bo mishum bishuli ovdei kochavim. I don't understand. One of the rules of what's forbidden because of bishul akum, because a Gentile cooked it, is any food which cannot be eaten raw, so that you have to cook it. And if it cannot, and a turmus is of that kind of product. So why then, just because they're not learned, are you banning it? You should ban it even if they were learned. It's under the rubric of bishul akum. So the Gemara answers, Rabbi Yochanan ki idach lishna sviralei da Amar Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak mishmei derav kol she'ein ola al shulchan melachim lechel bo es hapas ein bo mishum bishulei of the kochavim the time of the inon b'nei Torah shari. So the Gemara says, but there's a second qualification that Rabbi Yochanan had placed on something being asur because of bishul akum, and that is that it has to be oila al shulchan melachim. It has to be something that you would find on a king's table or on a dignitary's table. It has to be an important food. So you need two qualifications. You need that it has to be something that needs to be cooked in order to be edible, and number two, it's something that you'd find on a king's table. If it's something like a potato that is not normally found on a king's table, then even if it can only be eaten through cooking, still not is not a problem of bishul akum, and therefore the turmus, this turnip vegetable, is not a problem of bishul akum. But they banned it because they were worried that since these people are not learned, by allowing you to eat the cooked tormus of a Gentile, you'll come to permit other cooked foods, which are a problem of Bishul Akel. Okay, Tanu Rabbanu. Now let's go to the next brisa. Ger Shemol Velo Tovel. A Gentile's coming to convert. He gets a bris, but he doesn't go to mikvah. What is his halachic status? So Rabbi Eliezer, we have a three-way machlokus here. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Hareze Ger Shekein Matzinu Ba'avosenu Shemalu Velo Tovlu. So this person is a ger, because we find that our ancestors, when they left Egypt, all we know is that they had a bris milah. We don't know that they went to mikvah, and as a result, we see that if that was good enough to convert our ancestors to Judaism so that they could receive the Torah, then it's good enough for anyone else today as well. Taval v'lo mal. But what happens if the opposite? What happens if he goes to mikvah without getting a bris? So there, Rabbi Yoshua Omer Harei Ger Shekein Matzinu Be'imo Shetavlu V'lo Malo. So there, Rabbi Yoshua pipes up, and he says that that person is a valid ger as well. And how can I prove that to you? Our matriarchs, meaning our ancestors, the female ancestors who left Egypt, certainly didn't have a bris, but they must have converted some way, so they must have gone to mikvah. And if that's the case, then we see that just going to mikvah alone is enough, because if it's good enough for a woman to convert by going to mikvah, then it's good enough for a man as well, even though he doesn't have a bris. The Chachamim Omrim, but the Chachamim have a third shita, and they say that when it comes to a man who's converting to Judaism, Taval v'lo mal, mal v'lo taval, ein ger ad she'imol v'yitbol. That it makes no difference whether he only had tefillah or if he only had bris milah. That's not enough. You need to have both, and if not, there's no conversion. Rabbi Yoshua nami neilaf me'avos. So now the Gemara's question is, Rabbi Yoshua seems to disagree with Rabbi Eliezer in the case of a guy who just had a bris but didn't go to mikvah. But what about Rabbi Eliezer's argument that you can learn from our ancestors? And Rabbi Eliezer nami neilaf me'imos. And why doesn't Rabbi Eliezer assent to Rabbi Yoshua's argument that if you have tefillah without milah, that should be enough because women are converted that way? Maybe for the latter question, why Rabbi Eliezer does not agree that you can extrapolate from the fact that women have converted historically without having a bris that men can too. He says maybe it's because you can't compare something that's possible from something to something that's not possible. Just because women don't have a bris and they can still convert has no bearing on a man who has the ability to have a bris. A woman physically can't have a bris. And maybe that's the reason why they don't need a bris to convert. But that's got no bearing on what a man needs. So, but wait a minute, V'hatanya, but that's not true. You see, I'll show you that according to Rabbi Eliezer, you can extrapolate from an impossible case to a possible case. Because Rabbi Eliezer Omer minayin lepesach doros she'ein ba ela min hachulin. Because there's a brisa that states as follows: how do you know that a korban pesach animal must be purchased from chulin money, meaning money that already has not been sanctified? Whereas, let's say, what's an example of sanctified money? Money that has had meiser sheni produce transferred onto it, so the money has been sanctified. How do you know that you can't use that money to purchase the lamb for the korban pesach? Nemar pesach b'mitzrayim v'nemar pesach b'doros. Ma pesach omer b'mitzrayim ein ba ela min hachulin, af pesach omer l'doros ein ba ela min hachulin. So Eliezer says, look, the very first korban pesach could not have come from sanctified money because there was no law of sanctification when the Jews left Egypt. There was no din of hektish, there was no din of meiser sheni yet. And yet you see that, therefore, the only way that you could have a korban pesach when we first left Egypt was by using regular money. So too, in every subsequent generation, you can only use regular money in order to purchase a korban pesach. So Amarle Rabbi Akiva v'chidanin efsher mishi efsher. So Rabbi Akiva turns to Rabbi Eliezer and he says, how can you compare the two? Just because the first korban pesach was brought from non-sanctified money, it's because there was no sanctification in operation yet. That's not a proof to what the halacha would be when sanctified money is a possibility. So he's arguing you can't learn a possible case from an impossible case. So Amarlei Afal Pishi Efsher Rai Gedoli V'Nilmad Heimena. And Rabbi Eliezer's argument in response was, I disagree. even though it wasn't possible to have a Korban Pesach purchased from sanctified money when we left Egypt, because there was no sanctified money, nevertheless, it is possible to adduce from there that you have to dafka purchase the Korban Pesach from non-sanctified money. And the Gemara's argument, therefore, is you see that Rabbi Eliezer holds of done in Efsher Mishi Efsher. You can learn the possible from the impossible. And if that's the case, why don't we learn that men don't need a bris because women don't need a bris? That's our question.
I mean, you're running from the others to Mitzrayim. I mean, they're still Jewish.
That's my question. They didn't need to go to Mitzrayim.
So the Gemara seems to be under the assumption, that's a good question, the Gemara is working under the assumption that the Jews, who were the descendants of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, who were slaves in Egypt, needed a formal gerus in order to be able to accept the Torah.
Was it because they mixed, or...?
No, not because they mixed. Even though they were bona fide descendants, they needed to go through a conversion process.
I was thinking maybe it was the heir of Rob who came up with them, who needed both of them, and maybe they only needed this.
Rashi says exactly the words as follows: Kishiyatsu mimitzrayim, when our ancestors left Egypt, v'yatsu michlal b'nei Noach lekabel haTorah ulekabel pnei hashchina, that they departed from their status of Noachides and became Jews in order to be able to commune with the divine presence. So that there was a formal process of conversion that was necessary. There's a lot of Torah on this, of course, but it's very clear from our sugya that that's the way we're learning. Okay? So anyway, the question that we leave with on Rabbi Eliezer is, why do you, Rabbi Eliezer, seemingly disagree with Rabbi Yoshua that Tevila alone is not enough for a man? So the Gemara says, you're right. B'tavel v'lo mal kule alma lo pligi demahane, ki pligi b'mal v'lo tavel. So we're going to modify our position. Really, Rabbi Eliezer agrees that just having a tefillah without milah is good enough for a man to convert. The only machlokus is, what if you only have milah without tefillah? There, Rabbi Eliezer yolif me avos, but Rabbi Yoshua be avos nami tefillah hava. Rabbi Eliezer says you can learn from the avos who didn't have tefillah and yet they're still considered to be converts. And Rabbi Yoshua says no. The males who left Egypt not only had milah, but they also had tefillah, and therefore you have no raya from there. So minole, how does Rabbi Yeshua know that? Because if we look at the Torah, when it talks about their preparation for receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai, it says that God tells Moshe, go to the nation, sanctify them today and tomorrow, and they shall launder their garments. Now what does laundering their garments mean? Uma b'makom she'ein ton kibus ton tevila, makom sheton kibus ein odin sheton tevila. It sounds like to the Gemara that laundering your clothes means immersing them in a mikveh. Now, why do you have to immerse your clothes in a mikveh? Must be because you have some level of tumah. Now, we know that there are different levels of tumah. There are some levels of tumah for which you only have to immerse your body, but you don't have to immerse your clothes. It's only when you have a higher level of tumah that not only do you have to immerse your body, but you also have to immerse your clothes. So if God is instructing Moshe to tell the Jews to immerse their clothes, it must mean that they're also immersing their bodies, which is the prerequisite to immersing your clothes. So therefore the Gemara says, but no, v'dilma nekius ba'alma. But maybe that's not, when the God told Moshe to tell the Jews to launder their clothes, he wasn't telling them to immerse them in a mikveh. He was telling them to launder them, so that you should wear clean clothes when you're going to meet Hashem for the first time and receive His Torah because of derech eretz. Maybe that's all the pasuk is telling you. So you have no raya from there that they were Faivel, ela mehacha, but rather you learn from here. Vayikach Moshe es Adam vayizrok al ha'am ugemiri de'ein hazah below tevila. That it says that at Matan Torah, Moshe took the blood from the sacrifices and sprinkled it upon the people. And Rabbi Yeshua says that I have a tradition that you never sprinkle blood on a person unless he's first gone to mikveh. So this proves that our ancestors who left Egypt not only had bris milah, but they also went to mikveh. And therefore you have no raya from there that if a person only has a bris but doesn't go to mikveh, that he's a convert. For Rabbi Yoshua, tefila bi'imahus minolan, svarahu dimkein b'menichnos utachas kanfei hashchina. Now how does Rabbi Yoshua know that our female ancestors went to mikveh? Where's the pasuk there? So Rabbi Yeshua says it's a svara. How could they convert from being b'nei Noach to being Jews? They couldn't have a bris, so they must have gone through some protocols, through some process, and the only thing that's left is tefillah. So therefore it must be that our imahos had tefillah. And therefore we learn from there that if someone goes to mikveh, then that's all you need in order for them to convert to Judaism. So Amar Reb Chia bar Abba Amar Reb Yochanan la'olam eino ger ad sheyimol v'yitbol. And Reb Yochanan says, we don't paskin that way. We paskin that you're not a ger unless you have both mila and tefillah as a male. So pshita yachid v'rabim halacha kerabim. So the Gemara says, isn't that obvious? We just showed a three-way machlokas: Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yoshua, and the Chachamim. The Chachamim say you need both. Well, we know that if a yachid ever goes up against the Chachamim, we always paskin like the Chachamim. So why did we need Rabbi Yochanan to affirm that for us? Man Chachamim Rabbi Yossi. So the Gemara says because the Chachamim of that brisa is also an individual, not a group of rabbis. It goes according to Rabbi Yossi. And Rabbi Yossi was only called the Chachamim in order to reinforce him by the author of the brisa. But it's really not a majority of rabbis who side that way. The Tanya, Harei Shabava, Omar Malti Velotavalti, Matbilanos Oma Bekach Diva Rabbi Yehuda. Look at this machlokus. We have a machlokus, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi. A guy comes to us and he says, I had a bris milah, and we say, well, who was there? He says, no, I just did it on my own. And then he says, but I didn't go to mikvah. So we say to him, says Rabbi Yehuda, listen, we're sorry that you didn't have a bris milah. We can't accept your bris milah because it wasn't done with supervision. But since Tvila alone is enough, you can just go to mikvah and everything's fine. That's what Rabbi Yehuda says. But Rabbi Yossi Omer ein matbilin. Rabbi Yossi says no. Since you didn't have a kosher or bris, we're not going to let you toivel in the mikvah until you actually have a bris in front of us. You have to do a hatafas dam bris so that we know that you're doing it l'shem gerus. So you see that Rabbi Yossi requires both proper bris and tefillah b'mikvah, and therefore that's why Rabbi Yochanan has to tell us we paskin like Rabbi Yossi. And then the brisa continues and it says Lifichach matbilin ger b'shabes diva Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbi Yossi Omer ein matbilin. And it's for that reason that when we know that he had a kosher or bris, Rabbi Yehuda says you can toivel him in the mikvah because the tevilah is not the final process of conversion. Since Rabbi Yehuda holds you can have either or. You can either have a bris without tevilah, or you can have tevilah without bris. As long as we know that he had a kosher or bris, then he's already a yid, and therefore he can go to mikvah on Shabbos and there's no problem. But Rabbi Yossi says no. Rabbi Yossi says, even when you know that he had a kosher or bris, since I require that he has both, we're not going to allow him to go to mikveh for the first time on Shabbos, because we're not allowed to perform a conversion on Shabbos because you're creating something on Shabbos. It's a tikkun that you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. Amar Mar, lefichach matbilan ger b'Shabbos. So let's go back to that statement. According to Rabbi Yehuda, you're allowed to let the ger go to mikveh for the first time on Shabbos, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Pshita, Kevin Amar Rabbi Yehuda b'chadasag yehecha demala fanenu matbilin. My lefichach. Why do we need Rabbi Yehuda to say that? Isn't that obvious? Once Rabbi Yehuda already revealed to us that one without the other makes him into a ger, so once we know that he had a kosher or bris, obviously he doesn't need tevilah anymore, and therefore it's okay for him to go on Shabbos. So why did he have to spell it out for us? So mahu detema l'Rebbe Yehuda tevilah ikar u'tevilah b'Shabbos lo dekamasakin gaver kamash malan de Rebbe Yehuda oha boy. The answer is like this. From the brisa alone, it's not really clear. You could have inferred something different. You could have inferred that according to Rabbi Yehuda, all you need is tevilah without a bris. But the opposite, maybe Rabbi Yehuda would not be so would be so lenient, and therefore maybe even when we know that he had a kosher or bris, Rabbi Yehuda would still require him to go to mikvah before he's toivel, and that's why he needed to spell it out. That I hold that you either need mikvah without a bris or bris without a mikvah. And therefore, if he goes to if he already had a kosher or bris, it's no problem for him to go to mikvah on Shabbos. Now let's go to Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi Omer ein matbilin. So Rabbi Yossi says you can't because I hold you need both. But pshita tekevin da Omer Rabbi Yossi tarti ba'in and tikuni gaver b'Shabbos lo mesaknina. Why do we need Rabbi Yossi to spell that out for us? Once he's told us that you need to have both, then obviously you can't go to mikvah on Shabbos because you're rectifying, you're doing a tikkun of a person on Shabbos. The Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Mahu detema Rabbi Yossi mila ikar v'hasam hu delo havoi mila bifanenu. Because maybe you would have inferred differently from Rabbi Yossi, that according to Rabbi Yossi, really all you need is a bris. And in the first case, where he didn't have a bris in front of a beis din, that's why we require him to have a second bris. But if he already had a bris, and we've affirmed that he's had a legitimate conversion process through a circumcision, maybe Rabbi Yossi would agree, okay, let him go to mikveh, but it's not the main part of his conversion, and therefore he could do it on Shabbos. Kamash Malan de Rabbi Yossi Tarti Boy. And therefore, no, we need to reinforce the fact that it's Rabbi Yossi firmly requires two, that one without the other is meaningless. Omar Rabba, Uvda Hava Bey Rabbi Chia bar Rabbi, V'Rav Yosef Masni Reb Oshia bar Rabbi, V'Rav Safra Masni Rabbi Oshia bar Rabbi Chia. Now we have different opinions as to who was present, but the first opinion is that it was only Rabbi Chia was present. Rav Yosef says, no, not only was Rabbi Chia there, but Rabbi Oshia bar Rabbi was there also. And Rav Safra says, no, not only were those two rabbis there, but there was even a third rabbi, Rav Oshia bar Rabbi Chia. So according to him, all three sages were there. Da'asa l'kame ger shemal v'lo tava. And that a Gentile who had converted through bris milah, but didn't have a tefillah in the mikveh, comes before them. Amru le shehi kan ad lamachar v'nat belinach. And so he said to the convert, he says, wait until tomorrow morning. It's already nighttime now. Wait until tomorrow morning and come back to us, and we'll take you to the mikveh to finish the conversion. So the Gemara now says, Shma mina tzlas. We can learn three things from that story. Shma mina ger tzarich shlosh. So the first thing we learn is that a ger you need to have three rabbis present, because after all, that's why we were taught that there were three sages present. Ushma mina Eino gerat sheyimol v'yitbol. And number two, we learned that you're not a ger from this story until you have both milah and tefillah. Ushma mina ein matbilan ger b'layla. And the third thing that we can infer is that you can't do a tefillah for a ger at night. It has to be done during the daytime, just like certain adjudications in front of beis din. So now the Gemara says, but why don't we say we can learn a fourth thing? Maybe why don't we infer from this whole story that not only do you need three on a beis din, but they need to be three expert sages, just like in this story. So the Gemara says, Dilma di'iklau. No, it could be that it just happened by coincidence that there were three expert sages, but you don't see necessarily from the story that they have to be mamish talmidei chachamim. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yechanan, ger tzarich gimel, because mishpat ksiv bey. Why does a ger need a beis din of three to convert him, to be present when he goes to mikveh and has his bris? Because the Torah says that v'chiyagur itachem ger, that mishpat echad yelachem kager ka'ezrachiyah, that there shall be one law for the convert and the resident, which teaches me that the word law equates gerus to law, just like in cases of mishpat, you need to have a beis din present of three sages. So too, when a person converts to Judaism, you need to have three people present.
Rabbi, why can we learn from that story that we just had that you need three? Because there were different opinions as to how many there were there. It's only according to the one person who said we had three.
Right. So Rashi points out that the reason why that third opinion was so assertive in saying that there was a third sage there is because, according to that last opinion, he holds that you need to have three. So the Gemara is acknowledging it's only according to that last opinion you learn that you need to have three. Tana Rabbana, Mishaba ve'omar gerani yachol nekablenu. Now we have an interesting statement. The Brisa says that if a guy walks into shul one day and he says, I'm a chiyuv, and they say, well, who are you? Never saw you before in our life. He says, I'm a ger. So that you might think that we're allowed to accept him. Tamulomar itcha b'muchsak lach. So the Torah says, no, you don't have to accept him, because the Torah says, v'chiyagur itacha ger ba'artzachem lo sonu, so that when there shall live a ger together with you in your land, do not oppress him. So what we learn from the word itacha is that he has to be verified. He has to be known to you to be a ger in order for you to accept him. Ba ve'edav imo minayin. Let's say now a guy who claims he's a ger and he has witnesses who testify, yes, we know that he's a ger. So how do you know that in that situation we do accept him? Tamulomar v'chiyagur ger ba'artzachem. That when the ger shall live in your land. So the very fact that he lives in your land and we verify that he lives in our land, that means that we can accept him as a full-fledged Jew. Then the Brisa continues and it says, Ein li ela ba'aretz, v'chutz la'aretz minayin. But that only is in Eretz Yisrael. That we need to have some level of verification that he's a legitimate convert. How do you know that we need the same thing in Chutz La'aretz? Tamulomar itacha b'chol makom she'itacha. That therefore the Torah says itacha no matter where you are. Im kein ma tamulomar ba'aretz. Ba'aretz tzarach lahavi raya, b'chutz la'aretz ein tzarach lahavi raya, divrei Rabbi Yehuda. That according to Rabbi Yehuda, that there is a difference between Eretz Yisrael and chutz la'aretz. In Eretz Yisrael, you need to bring a higher level of verification that not only do these Eidim testify that he's a ger, but we actually saw his conversion in Beis Din. Or we have some kind of proof that he was Megayer in Beis Din. Whereas in chutz la'aretz, you don't need that level of verification. Now why? What's the difference between Eretz Yisrael and chutz la'aretz? The answer is that in Eretz Yisrael, there's a fear that maybe a person will convert because of the great security that he'll have living in the Jewish state. Just like we have today. We have all these Russian immigrants, and many of them would want to claim that they're Jewish because of the zchuyot, because of all of the privileges they will get from the law of return. So the same thing was true even in Talmudic times, is that you have to make sure that you have to make extra sure that the person's a ger. In chutz la'aretz, where there is no incentive to be Jewish, you don't need the same level of verification. V'chachamim omrin bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz tzarach lahavi raya. So, and the chachamim disagree, and they say whether we're dealing with a guy in Eretz Yisrael or in chutz la'aretz, he always needs to bring a higher level of verification that he is taka, a legitimate convert, and he's got evidence that he converted in front of the Beis Din. Now, I want to go back to that very first statement, and with this we'll finish. Guy walks into shul and he says, I'm a chiyuv, I need an aliyah. And you say, well, who are you? Kohen, Levi, Yisrael. He says, I'm a ger. So the Mish Brisa seems to be saying that we don't accept him sight unseen. So Rabbeinu Tam asks a very simple question. He says, why not? Do we always check a person's papers when he walks into shul? What if a guy were to walk into shul and say, Ich bin a Yid, I'm a Jew, and I'm a chiyuv? We're going to ask him, show me your papers. Who was your mother? Who was your, right? Of course not. So why doesn't a guy have a migu? What's the migu? The force of the power of the argument. I could have said that I'm just a Yid. I told you even more than that. I told you I'm a ger. So why don't you accept me? So Rabbeinu Tam says you're right. If a guy we don't know him from Adam, and he walks in and he says he's a ger, then we do accept him sight unseen, and we'll give him an aliyah, right? We'll even give him shishi, right? But if it's available, right? But if we knew from before, we know, hey, you're Joe the milkman, right? And Joe the milkman, you're Italian. We know you're Joe Paisano, and so how could you tell us that you're Jewish? He says, yeah, I was Megayer. That's the case where the Brisa says that he's got to bring proof that we don't accept them sight unseen, because we knew before you're Joe Paisano, so that's why we don't accept you. So it's an important halacha as far as, and there may be halachic ramifications, there may have been shifts in halacha. Today, if a person says I'm a ger, there may be other problems, right? If we don't know him from Adam. What kind of gerus did you have? Gerus today is a very, very tricky thing.